The Biden administration, much like with Iran, but now with the Palestinian Authority, looking at ways to use your money, your taxpayer money, to go to an organization, a Palestinian Authority, which has a law codified to pay terrorists, and they could use those funds. So the U.S. said no, but the Biden administration wants to get that money flowing again. They're looking for all these workarounds.
Now the Biden administration plans to resume taxpayer aid to the Palestinians, even though the Palestinian government continues to use money to pay convicted terrorists. This approach contravenes legislative and U.S. policy, and I hopefully we can find a way to show that it is completely illegal.
The Taylor Force Act blocks the U.S. funding to go directly to the Palestinian Authority until it changes its pay-for-slay program. The pay-for-slay policy is in essence, any Palestinian who carries out an attack against any Israeli is then their families receive money and compensation based on if they were killed or how long they go to prison or if they how brutal the attack was. But in this specific instance, there was an American attacked. He was former military, but he was no longer in the military. He was on a school trip to Israel, and yet the Palestinian Authority treated the attacker's family. He was the attacker, the terrorist, was killed after killing Taylor Force, but then this family received the pay-for-slay money. Pay-for-slay runs out of the PLO's office in Washington, D.C., which was shut down by the Trump administration, but the Biden administration wants to reopen.
There is a law that they must follow that they are now refusing to follow. But, Jordan, I really think that bipartisan support in the Congress ought to come back and say, no, you won't. We still have the power of the purse. We said once that you couldn't do this in both of these accounts. We're going to say it again. And by the way, if you try to go around us, we're just going to pull that account down altogether. We're not going to give you the money in the first place to choose to dispense. So this is the Biden administration's fault, Jordan, but that bipartisan coalition in Congress, they need to hear from us as well.
Over 7% of the Palestinian Authority's budget, $350 million, goes to the pay-for-slay program. Only $220 million go for non-terrorist welfare programs. So they spend more money paying families of terrorists than they do on trying to create a better life for their own people.
We should not be aiding the Palestinian Authority whatsoever. Most of those funds flow into Western banks in Paris, New York City, and in London. They do not help the Palestinian people. So instead, the Palestinian Authority, in some sense, is a state-sponsored, and I use that in quotes, a state sponsor of terror.
You wrote the piece up at aclj.org with Stuart Force. His son, who was served in the military, but was no longer in the military, was just a tourist in Israel. He wasn't Israeli. He wasn't Jewish. He was killed by a Palestinian terrorist. His name was Taylor Force. You wrote the piece with Stuart Force, his father.
The amount of money is absolutely staggering. It was great to write this. I wrote this along with Sandra Gerber, who's been deeply involved in this issue for an awfully long time. This is a perfect example of an administration not understanding that if you preemptively reward the Palestinian Authority by granting them U.S. taxpayer funds, while they are still underwriting these terrorists who prey on Israelis, prey on American citizens who are in Israel, that you're doing an enormous disservice.
The only reason these families need this assistance is because the government there, the governing entity there, the Palestinian Authority, was encouraging a family member to go and possibly lose their life as a terrorist, to kill an Israeli or even an American like Taylor Force. So, I mean, this is, to me, if that's the workaround and the Biden administration accepts that, I feel like America, we're paying blood money.
This isn't going to further Palestinian peace with Israel. This will only undermine the capacity to extend what we did with the Abraham Accords and build out a more peaceful, stable Middle East.
It's bad policy. There's laws in place to protect from that bad policy, but we're going to put FOIAs in to see how they're trying to work around the laws. I mean, this is an administration that they're just dying to get money into the hands of the Palestinian Authority that's got to pay for slay. Think about that program codified in their law.